All right. Hello, and welcome. Okay, so today I've got Mario from the end of history, and we're going to talk about Emmanuel Todd, Defeated the West. So this is a book, French intellectual. It was written, I think, about 2 years ago. It hasn't been translated into English yet officially. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you sent me a machine translated version. It felt like I was getting contraband or something, you know. And
Yeah.
anyway, so we're going to talk about this book because it's probably one of the most important books I think I've read in a few years. In general, it was a very very good book. Very important in many ways. So we're going to discuss that. So yeah, okay, Mario, do you want to, I mean, say hello and then just maybe give an outline about Todd? I don't think a lot of people in the Anglo sphere know about him or really know a lot about him. Have read him. So maybe just give him I don't know, a background of him and his work and so on.
Yeah, sure. Good to be with you again. I think I was on about 2 years ago, maybe a little more, the start of the Ukraine-Russia war. And I followed some of your stuff, especially the that lecture series on Virilio, um, which is really good. And we kind of dovetail in a lot of our like theory interests. But Emmanuel Todd first, I guess, came across my radar around the time of the Iraq War when he wrote a book called After the Empire, which is a very good sort of criticism of the US, its profligate spending, and the way it was basically trying to strong arm its allies and pursue a much more aggressive foreign policy after the end of the Cold War. So he represented a kind of tendency within French intellectual class to criticize the U.S. And I suppose he represents obviously he's an anthropologist, especially interested in demography, but he kind of cast a really distinctive figure within the French intellectual scene, first by working in the 70s on his doctorate, which was with Peter Laslett and Macfarlane in England at Cambridge, where he did work on English family structures and the origins of capitalism. And so he basically started out kind of criticizing the Marxist interpretation of the origins of capitalism with a argument that English individualism preceded the development of capitalism there. And I think while he was working on his doctorate, he wrote this book, The Final Fall, about the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union. And so he's, from there was a really original figure. And what he did in that book was look at, um, you know, um, increase in mortality, declining birth rates, um, other very kind of innovative ways of trying to pierce through the Iron Curtain to see what would be the most important indices for understanding the trajectory of Soviet society. And I think the book was published in the late 70s, so he was a little bit, before the collapse, but predicted it based on a lot of the most important indicators that would lead to the kind of dissolution of the Soviet system. And if anybody watches those Adam Curtis documentaries about, I mean, they're kind of in a lot of his documentaries, but he's done one called Trauma Zone, which is just a compilation of video footage of the end. Um, it gives a really good sort of visual representation of a lot of things he talks about in that book. And within the intellectual culture of the West at that time, he was sort of alongside a lot of people who were, um, I guess, within that wave of Nouvelle Philosophe, who championed human rights and much of the sort of articulation of ideas that would later be considered part of the sort of end of history kind of consensus. Nevertheless, he didn't think that the totalitarianism concept really explained that much and probably included more than it, illuminated. And shortly thereafter, he kind of breaks ranks from that tendency. And in the 80s, he joined this sort of National Institute for the Study of Demography. and did these studies on basically French voting patterns and explain their sort of solidity. And I think a lot of that is in a book called Structure of Ideology, in which she looks at kinship as a sort of major, as the sort of foundation stone for understanding ideological kind of complexes within national cultures. And so he's a kind of bridges the gap between anthropology as this, study of kinship that, goes back within the French tradition from Marcel Mauss, Durkheim, to structuralist anthropology, Levi-Strauss, um, that looked at primitive cultures, but he uses it within this kind of national lens to understand national cultures. And I think and that's what's really relevant for this, is because he's kind of trying to build up I wouldn't say it's systematic, but it's a way of kind of giving some real coordinates to understanding what, people nowadays might call vibe shifts, or the vibe of a country and the ideological kind of constellations therein.
Okay, good. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, yeah. So his anthropological stuff. People should watch the video. You sent it to me. I had already seen it. Uh, what's the YouTuber called? What
What if
if?
alt
What if all
history,
this?
or yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
he's a kind of a theory cell kind of
Hmm.
dude. Quite young guy. He's quite interesting guy, but he does a really really good video of the breakdown of family structures on coming from Emmanuel Todd's theories. I've sent that video to like three different people in the past like 6 months, because
Yeah.
it actually explains like it really explains a lot. Being Irish too, it explains a little bit because the Irish are actually in the same category as the Germanics, and then we're
Hmm.
not in the same category as the Anglos. So I
Hmm.
started to use that to evaluate things like the North of Ireland and like the tensions between, because basically, okay, maybe I'll explain it a little bit to people because basically you got like three or four major family structures in the world. You've got the Anglosphere, which is what he calls like the absolute nuclear family, which is like,
Uh,
am I right
I
in
think
saying
more it's
that?
more egalitarian nuclear. I think for like absolute nuclear, it's more like this like late 19th century German, in which the father has more power.
I think that's called the okay, yeah, you could be right, you could be right, but
Or
so
authoritarian nuclear is what it might be,
that's what I mean,
actually. Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
authoritarian.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah.
so. There's an authoritarian nuclear, and whatever he calls the Anglo-nuclear, I can't remember what it is. It's something like
Yeah.
absolute. But anyway, it's
Yeah.
these all have different structures. So you got like a Germanic one, which is the authoritarian nuclear family, which is very hierarchical, quite militant. Oldest son is very important. It's kind of the kind of noble European old school kind of thing. That's what we look at when we think of that, And then you've got the French and sort of I think maybe Italian are in the same category, and they are, I think, the equal family. So it's very much based around not paternal, more fraternal bonds. Like the
Yeah, yeah.
brothers inherit equally, and there's more a kind of a camaraderie, I suppose, in that sense. Then you've got the Anglosphere, which is the Anglosphere is mysterious to me. I don't really know exactly like how he formulates it, but it's something like it's it's one thing he says about it is that it's not as patrilineal as the other ones. It's a bit more.
Right.
It's not matriarchal. It's not matrilineal, but it's a bit more whatever the whatever the kind of term is, where it's a bit more equal between the mother and the father influence.
Yeah.
And obviously individualism is more important in this context too for some reason.
Yeah,
And
and of course too, feminism too. You can imagine, you can see
yes,
a direct
you can
line from
see it.
like a Pride and Prejudice, um, kind of world of this sort of like, drawing rooms and stuff, in which, women have much more sort of pride of place within the family and
Mm,
within within the emerging public sphere there than in other countries at the time. And then to the point we are now, in which, we have state officials, basically being radical, using terminology from radical feminism.
yeah, and all the the first feminist thinkers in the 19th century, like John Stuart Mill and so on, like The English, Anglo. So yeah, so that's one thing. And then you got the Russians and the Chinese, and the Russians are they're very patrilineal, but they're also extremely collectivistic. So they're similar to the Germans in the sense that they're very patrilineal, but they're not as hierarchical. They're more collectivistic. So that kind of explains communism, right? I mean, it explains communism. It's
Exactly.
like you've got an authoritarian father, Stalin, and you've got all
Yeah.
the brothers, everyone's camaraderie, brotherhood. So,
Yeah.
which is, and then he has all these interesting kind of quasi-Freudian insights about that, like the father figure is more comfortable when he's got one favorite son because the son will stand by him, but when he's got a multitude of equal sons, they might team up on him,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
take him over,
Yeah.
which is like the Freudian myth of the killing the father and
Totally.
everything. So
Yeah. And the horde.
the horde, the band of brothers kills the father and eats him, and then
Exactly.
it's absolutely fascinating stuff. And then the Chinese, I think, are similar to the Russians, right? And then you've got all the kind of Asian countries that are just I don't even I like honestly I just kind of I focused more on the Western and the Russian, but anyway,
Hmm.
he's got this really interesting anthropological structure, and people should look into this stuff themselves to see if they think it's legit or not. But I think it does seem to explain a lot about the like modern political ideology and forms of nationalism and everything like the French and the kind of fraternity, the English and the individualism and the feminism, the Germanics with the fascism of the 20th century, honor and duty and so on, and obviously the Russians and communism. It does lay out a pretty coherent sort of pattern. So that's where he's coming from. And one thing I think is interesting in this structure is that like it really puts a dampener on anyone who has this sort of universalistic liberal end of history narrative because you're like, oh, you're not just dealing with like different ideologies, you're dealing with like fundamentally different anthropological structures which go back to like primitive or at least medieval kind of times. And therefore, you're dealing with something which is not nearly as malleable as I think the kind of hegemonic liberals, universalist liberals want. And therefore, you're like, oh,
Hmm.
if you're in their position, you're like, oh God, like that's not good.
Hmm.
If you're in the other position, you're like, well, that is good because maybe there's more sort of hope for an alternative to the kind of hegemonic liberal project. But yeah, okay, I'll throw it back over to you there and see if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're very much right. I just would add that, he what he you could say what he's arguing against is the idea that was very that was prominent after World War II in the sort of dispensation of social science, which was that okay, there's modernity, and then the world will converge with it. And you can obviously that goes all the way to someone like Francis Fukuyama, whose End of History predicted, that there would be no more ideological kind of struggles beyond, societies converging with liberal democracy, and those that weren't in a liberal democracy would not be real contenders for, leading the world system. Um, and what I think Todd would say is that um, most all of these family structures, for the most part, are what got humanity through in different areas of the world through basically agrarian societies. As societies modernize, there is a vestige of of those kinship structures, and they still change. I mean, it's not like obviously in China it's a modern society. They're not still operating under the this sort of an archaic Confucian form or something like this, but that the vestiges of these family systems have a major ideological pull for them in terms of how they think about collectivity, how they think about the symbolic order in which individuals are related, and that different societies, for those reasons, for the reasons of like what the resonance is in in the vestiges of those family structures, um, that is what kind of orients ideology, political ideology.
Okay, good. Yeah, yeah. So, all right. So maybe we can go from here on to the more historical particulars of the decline, right? Because the book is called the decline or defeat of the West.
Yeah.
And it was defeat, right? Not decline, so defeat.
Yeah.
And he's not jumping on the bandwagon now. Like he's been predicting this stuff for a few decades, right? I mean, he
Yeah.
had a book. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but he had a book that came out early 2000s, End of the Empire. So I don't know. That's something which he I haven't read that one. I'm not sure if you have, but it does predict a lot of the as far as I know, of the contemporary situation. Is that correct?
I lost you for like about 10 seconds.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah,
So
I
you
was
just
just
repeat it? Yeah.
saying. Yeah, I was just saying the End of the Empire book.
Yeah.
That came out in the early 2000s, I think, or the late
Yeah.
90s. Yeah,
Hmm.
and that sort of predicted a lot of the like later decline, which we're seeing more evidently today, when a lot of people were in a more triumphalistic sense of liberal hegemony. He was kind of predicting that. So he's not just jumping on the bandwagon. Like this guy is clearly kind of proven. He's kind of tried and tested nearly at this point in his
Hmm.
theoretical kind of competence. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to comment on that, but also maybe we should talk about the general end of the this liberal hegemonic period, because like for him it's not just geopolitics, it's also he talks about nihilism a lot in the book.
Yeah.
He talks about the end of the Protestant work ethic, and he's not polemical against the Protestant world and the Protestant work ethic. He's just saying that it's clearly done, and like he's got a few chapters in the book, few sections in the book, pretty much dedicated to like the end of the WASPs. You know, the
Yeah.
the WASP elites of the 19th century and the kind of early 20th century are basically gone. What like that? Maybe that's an interesting topic to sort of circle around for a few minutes, because like why they're gone is interesting, because they sort of kind of almost faded away into the background. Like they weren't defeated in a big geopolitical conflict or like a revolution or anything. Like they sort of just faded away. The wasps just kind of like wasps, they flew off somewhere, never to
Yeah.
be seen again. So I find this topic sort of interesting. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, there's someone else who's written a lot of interesting stuff on this is Eric Kaufman, who I
Yeah.
think also has written about Ireland, but one of his you could say he's a kind of he's also a cultural commentator, cultural anthropologist who is especially interested in the evolution of 20th century WASP culture in America, but in general Anglo-American culture. And one of the distinctive things of it, and this comes from the older trajectory or longer trajectory of Protestant individualism um, in England, but then it really kind of, you can see it proliferates and fragments, especially kind of ensconced in a, old boys club who go to their, dinner clubs and drink, brandy and smoke cigars and talk about politics and handle deals and all that kind of stuff. But they were also very cosmopolitan. And it's the openness, especially after World War One, that is a kind of, sort of distinctive aspect of, high culture and middlebrow culture in America, that already in the 20s you're having this sort of um, despite the end of immigration and sort of kind of reversal of some of the immigration policies in the 20s, the beginning of within the literary scene, the art scene, openness to other cultures, world cultures, and bringing that in. Think of all the avant-garde cultures that bring in art from all over the world. Think of Celebration of Picasso, contemporary art museums, and all that stuff. Like that was in a sense, a beginning of the watering down of the distinctiveness of WASP culture. And over the generations, its openness has, in some way, removed that. But with that comes the end of their sort of sense of responsibility to lead, right? And one of the things he talks about in this book is um, well, one of the examples he uses is look at the during World War II, at the end of World War II, look at how at what rate the elites in America taxed themselves, the sense of noblesse oblige they had
Mm.
towards, both serving in the military, but also
Your audio is gone.
sides to it.
Oh, it's
Is it
back.
gone
Sorry.
still?
No, it's back
Okay.
now. Sorry, it's back now. Yeah.
Yeah.
It just cut out there for about 10 seconds, but it's back
Yeah. Global communications isn't as seamless as the cosmopolitans want it to be.
as they make it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
You were saying about the noble age sort of taxing themselves. That
Yeah, yeah. So at the end of World War II, they're taxing themselves at, 60%. Their
mm,
own children are going off to war. Whereas nowadays there is not the same sense of service.
mm,
And so too, even within elite institutions, there's a lot less of a kind of a rigor. That's one
mm,
of the things too. He kind of focuses on through parts of the book. The and we see this in the kind of cultural wars roiling through the university, the loss of the canon of terms of books to read and
mm,
what kind of cultural ideals to kind of enforce is a symptom of that. And he doesn't think it's not like he thinks it's all bad. And everything he's saying here is in a sense value free. He thinks there's good things and bad things. It's not as though he thinks that the uh, evolution or the individualism which comes out of that and first appears, especially like in the amongst the baby boomers in the 60s and the new left, and it's sort of more hedonistic individualism is all bad. But what he's trying to do, right, is show the what happens to go back on these trend lines and show what is the natural progression of this and where cultures can kind of find themselves in a cul-de-sac or a kind of loss of rootedness
mm,
in value orientations. And so what he's doing there is trying to show what are the causes of this sort of fragmented individualism today, in which there is a kind of he goes from he would describe let me go back a little and say so he describes Protestantism is in a sense because it's so individualistic and it doesn't have this sort of hierarchy and dogmatic kind of control over doctrine. It proliferates a lot of differences in um, religious experience and religious belief, and that Protestantism is for him what he calls a zombie religion. And obviously, that zombie word makes it sound bad, but he doesn't think it's all bad. Um, but from there, you get to a 0 point of religion in which we find ourselves in, which there's nothing sacred, and it's sort of all about individual gain. And so there's a kind of loss of the sense of community that, or a constitutive sort of sense of communal belonging. That is what he's tracking, and he thinks now America is in that, and it's very much in danger of a kind of death spiral and a fragmented culture.
yeah, yeah. Okay, it's good. Yeah, and like I think we see that even taking on a kind of almost ontological level with the internet and with kind of trans and with transhumanism, because it's like it's not just value systems which are fragmented or sort of social value, collective social values, but it's even like reality which is fragmented nowadays. And then you can
Yeah.
get into like the French seem to have a real grasp of this, because you got Virilio, you got Emmanuel Todd, and then also the other guy that you sent me, Oliver Roy,
Oh,
who's I've been reading his
yeah.
book, and it's pretty similar points about the canon, loss of the canon, and loss of any shared values. For some reason, the French seem to be kind of early to this problem,
Mhm.
and yeah, so you kind of get this fragmentation within the Anglosphere. particularly as it globalizes. And then, yeah, you've got all these individualized value systems, and then you've got these individualized reality frameworks, basically, I think, at a certain point. And then that kind of gets a bit psychotic because if we have
Yeah.
all individualistic like reality frameworks, that's not just socially and politically problematic. It becomes like very deeply psychologically problematic and epistemically problematic, you know?
Yeah.
So
And decadent,
that's,
dare I say decadent.
yeah, decadent too, because of course, like who are you to tell anyone to restrict their kind of personal freedom in order to, it used to be like the conservatives used to say you can't, like, it used to be like, oh, you can't tell us to restrict our personal freedom in order to force us to, engage in some sort of collective value system. But now it's like you can't tell us what's real. It's like
Yeah.
you can't inhibit our personal freedom by telling us like but not telling us like it's a ideological thing by observing, what's real.
Yeah.
And obviously that plays out in like I think particularly the trans issue and all these other issues. So it's
Oh, and the
it's
use of disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. You could see that's like a kind of
yeah.
like a ruling class that doesn't know how to like
Mm.
adjust to things it doesn't want.
Yeah, yeah. And also um there's so many factors to this decline which are so dark. I mean, you have the kind of euthanasia kind of processes going on now, like people like the use of um like kind of like medical science, to maybe, like, oh, we don't want to deal with these poor people and unemployed people. You got the people in the Midwest and the US who are being given these drugs, these opioid, like consciously been given drugs, which we know are addictive to them. And then you've got like euthanasia stuff going on with these suicide clinics. And it's like really getting into the very dark phases of this decline. I think at the moment it's getting harder and harder to ignore. Um, and yeah, so the old elites are like really without answers and really kind of I think they're coming across to people as quite deranged and predatory as well a little bit.
Yeah.
Like even the COVID stuff was just like I was in shock for a lot of that. I was like, I kind of thought these elites were, not adequate to my standards, but like better than this. It was quite difficult to see like how deranged the whole upper strata of society, because and not just the upper strata, even like the middle and upper middle class, the well-educated people,
Exactly.
had become so easy to willingly easy, perhaps, I don't know, to just buy into nonsense. And I suppose, that's at least invoked, I think, a bit of a kind of a grassroots pushback intellectually and so on. But
Mhm.
it's scary. It's worrying. I do feel like, it's very Game of Thronesy. Like the old elites, the old rulers have been killed, and now we're kind of in this chaotic middle period where we don't really have a
We don't
um,
have old gods and new. We don't have the old gods.
we don't have the old gods. We don't have any new gods yet.
Yeah.
We're just in no man's land. So yeah, it's pretty worrying, and I think that does obviously relate to a lack of shared values and a lack of canon. Oliver Roy, the other French intellectual
Mhm.
I mentioned earlier, he brings that up a lot. The lack of values, lack of faith, lack of shared faith, and lack of canon. I like it's a point I sort of polemically made on my blog recently, was that like the well-educated today get their opinions from the entertainment industry. I mean,
Mhm.
they don't get their values from literature. They don't get their values from philosophy. They don't get their values from the Bible or from the church. They get their values from the entertainment industry, like primarily.
Yeah.
And that's not just young kids on TikTok. Like that's boomers who are wealthy and successful and have master's degrees when they're, like, it's an entertainment industry complex, like, and that's so it's terrible. But anyway,
No, yeah, and it's not something you can sort of synthetically like create again. That's what's also kind of scary. It's,
mm,
when you're at this point in a culture, you can't just sort of like when Nietzsche says, God is dead and we killed him. It's no longer for him, intellectually respectable to just like create another religion and believe in God the way people used to believe in God.
mm,
And that transvaluation that he predicts come in the coming century um, produce this nihilism, right? And it might be useful maybe to compare. the German nihilism, which led to the Third Reich and the United States today. And I'm gonna read I'll read a quote from him because I think it does a good job of like showing the family similarities without, becoming too steeped in a kind of find, trying to find, a perfect match or anything. Um, he says, prima facie, it seems absurd to compare Biden to Hitler or Nazis to the American political system or America's pluralist democracy to the anti-Semitic Third Reich. But nihilism can give us some understanding of their similar trajectories. Like German nihilism in the past, this negativity is the product of a decomposition of Protestantism. But this does not occur at the same stage. Nazism appeared in its first phase after between 1880 and 1930, and Protestantism had ceased to be an active religion when Protestantism had ceased to be an active religion. Nazism corresponds to an eruption of despair during its zombie phase, at a time when Protestant values, positive and negative, persisted despite the glory of religious practice. The zombie phase of American Protestantism has been overwhelmingly positive. It goes roughly from the presidency of Roosevelt to that of Eisenhower, and it saw the creation of a social state, universities providing mass and quality education, and the spread of an optimistic culture which seduced the world. This America had recovered the positive values of Protestantism, high educational level, egalitarianism among whites, and was trying to get rid of its negative values, racism and Puritanism. So that's the WASP openness, The current crisis corresponds, on the other hand, to the landing in state zero of Protestantism.
Mm.
And so his account of nihilism is nothing like you're probably familiar with uh, well, obviously Nietzsche, but Heidegger's you know kind of uh, description of the end of metaphysics, or Leo Strauss's essay on nihilism, which was, it's much more about a kind of an end of values, but also this sort of um, kind of radical openness of humanity to um, ideological and technological forces that would then, kind of unmoor humanity from these, older, more sacred values. Um, and it's a lot for him. This nihilism in America is not nearly pitched at that high philosophical kind of level. It's much more just rampant. Think of it as individualism, consumerism, and a kind of kind of irresponsibility of the elites.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I actually I find this, and people are going to accuse me of being a resentful Catholic Irishman here, but I find this sort of discussion of the end of Protestantism pretty funny because like people like we love to talk about the end of the Catholic hegemony and power in Europe, for example, with
Mhm.
both the Reformation and the bourgeois states which emerged, which obviously put the church kind of in its place. And
Yeah,
which like I'm not defending, I'm not saying this wasn't in some
yeah,
sense good or necessary, blah blah blah. But it's just interesting because like what we're seeing right now is the end of Protestant values. Like we're seeing the decline of the Protestant world that we all live in. And again, to use Ireland as an example, I remember like back in like 20, I don't know what it was, like 2017, 18 or something, there was a vote on abortion, and obviously like it's a big deal for Catholic. It's like one of the big Catholic things, right? And so
yeah,
it wasn't really a vote on abortion. It was a kind of I think a kind of propaganda fest, because look, if you're in Ireland and you want to get an abortion, go over to the UK and you can get it for free. Like it's not,
yeah,
like it's like a 30 quid plane ride if you get a Ryanair ticket. Like it's not
yeah,
like,
right.
oh
Yeah,
my God, you're depriving these people of something. It was a very much a symbolic moment, and there was all these like very grotesque sort of like triumphalistic kind of celebratory protests and like celebrations after the vote happened and it was legalized, and the constitution in Ireland has been eaten away in very negative ways. I think I'm not saying that I think the abortion legislation, just for the record, was probably too rigid, right? It would probably needed to be a little bit updated,
yeah,
but like
yeah,
not updated to the extent perhaps that it was, but also it's not even about the actual laws. It was all symbolic, and it's funny because we seem to be living in this kind of hangover where we're still sort of beating the dead dog of the patriarchy or of Catholicism or of the older world, where actually what we should be talking about and analyzing and thinking about is the end of the kind of modern Protestant world that we live in, because that's actually what is like we're living in that decline. We're not living in the other decline. The other decline happened a long time ago. It's done. Um,
Yeah.
and it was interesting actually that you brought up the connection between Germany and his quote on between German nihilism, American nihilism, because it was actually like the Prussians who were the ruling class in Germany kind of unified Germany, and they were Lutheran. So the Catholics in the south um, weren't in charge of unifying Germany. It was the Lutheran regime, and the Protestants in the Prussians were, extremely, competent rulers, great military men, very dedicated, very sacrificial. We know Kant is from that Prussian Baltic region,
Mhm.
and his obviously his philosophy, his sense of duty and reason and so forth, kind of reflects
Mhm.
all of that. So, like, obviously, this Protestant modernity, this Protestant world, gave us so much to give us so much to work with. But we are in a decline period, and I do find it just interesting that like not many people have sort of like moved their analysis to where we actually are. Um,
Mhm.
the left in particular seems to be stuck as in a previous time period, beating a dead dog.
Yeah,
Um,
it sort of still lives under the shadow of boomer truth. It's basically
yeah,
we're still fighting this sort of um, it's against sexism, against the patriarchy, racism, and xenophobia. And in reality, we live in very open societies. And I think that Todd describes basically the contemporary West as a liberal oligarchy.
mm,
Very important. Most people can't, process that a system that is sort of closed off by wealth hierarchy can also be open culturally. But
yeah,
very much the thing that happened at the end of the, Roman Empire, that the openness to, kind of elite selection at the top to people in, minority groups um, can be a very difficult world for the everyday people or the mass of the population to live under, while they pat themselves on the back for being so cosmopolitan, open,
yeah,
and understanding and tolerant. Um, and the left today is still kind of operates under the I would argue illusion that capitalism has to have sexism and racism in order to function, which in another era I believe was true in a lot of ways. I mean, I think that especially in the racism part in America, um, anti-black racism was a constitutive aspect of capitalism all the way up to the post, and after the post-war period in terms of dividing the working class, but also just in terms of the regional development of the South and the North and, in the West. But that process has basically been dissolved, and we live in a neoliberal order, which is very inegalitarian, very creates a lot of inequality, and a lot of the, effects of that continue to exist, meaning that, for example, in America, blacks are still underrepresented in institutions, are at the bottom of the social ladder increasingly, but it doesn't mean that it continues because of racism,
mm,
right? It's getting much more and more difficult for everyone to attain social mobility. And so people who were starting out in an earlier, who were starting out at the bottoms of the rungs are going to have a much more difficult time climbing up too. But it doesn't mean it's because of pervasive prejudice, right? And oftentimes, a lot of the measures for, um, you know, um, diversity, equity, and inclusion are really just a kind of, uh, upper middle class and elitist routine or ritual in order to make sure there's a proper representation at the top, and basically lead the way or open the way for middle class minorities to get up to move up, as opposed to doing anything for those said minorities at the bottom. And so then you have all these sort of I would call it kind of yeah, performative and slightly out of touch displays of that openness and
Mm,
that like kind of tolerant ethos that does nothing to actually rectify these problems in society, but instead just make sure that people look up to a few people who are in their ethnic group at the top. And that's a very, I think that's a really distinctive aspect of our period. And there have been people, very, draw people's attention to people like Adolf Reed Jr., who's an American commentator who's really diagnosed this, basically his whole career.
mm.
And
Yeah.
another thing about Todd is just he just to show how, I wouldn't say not slippery, but how sort of dexterous he is. He thinks he can both say that American identity was once very much dependent on anti-black racism, that was
Yeah.
a big part of constructing a white identity that was um, created a sense of responsibility within the white ruling classes to also show their sense of responsibility for lower class whites and improve their conditions, especially after World War One, and create material abundance. But because that was so constitutive of white identity, being white meant not black. And so once that is diffused, you have this loss of this kind of responsibility. And so it's kind of a, um, you have there's a negative and a positive to everything. And at
Mm.
the cultural level, he diagnoses that.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that's a good way of putting it, though. The elites of our time are culturally, hyper open, but politically and economically oligarchical. And that's very accurate. Yeah, like one thing I'm always constantly criticizing the just this endless pursuit of like tolerance just for the sake of tolerance, completely groundless, detached from reality, detached from duty or anything. Very fetishistic
Mhm.
and performative and incongruous sort of morality, if you can even call it that. And I think something that I was thinking the other day was like how like a lot of people from my generation, I'm like millennial, but I'm just barely in the millennial category. I'm like 3 years away from the Zoomers, but I'm in the young millennial category, and so many people from my generation, it's like they're wearing the costume of the 60s the whole time. Like their lives are a
Yep.
kind of costume party to the 60s cultures, but it's just so like I would like I think the 60s was obnoxious in many ways and wrong in many ways, but I think it was more like people involved at the time, I think they did have a genuine concern for spirituality or for politics or for economics, and then they also sort of introduced a kind of a kind of identitarian, kind of progressive identitarian aspect to it. But nowadays, like I just think that that most people that consider themselves on the left or liberal or whatever, especially the younger generations, really are just like the everything is about that cultural kind of toleration and openness, performatively signaling
Yep.
it 24/7. Like they don't care. Like COVID just proved to me, they don't care about freedom. you know? They don't even care
Yeah.
about like classical liberal freedom. They don't care about it. Like they don't care about truth. They don't care about class. They don't care about anything like that. They only care about this like one monolithic kind of virtue signaling. I know it's a kind of cheesy word to use, but just pursuit of individual liberation and freedom, and they're wearing the kind of like costume of the 60s, and it's really weird. And anyway, but that's just
No, no. I mean, it's that Marx quote: "The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living."
yeah.
Boomers are to us what, the 1848 revolution, 18 revolutionaries was to the French Revolution.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Yeah, we need different costumes to wear. I think that's
And
the
it's not, which is not to say we should abandon tolerance and all the things that they won. It's just that we need to realize the distinctive nature of the problems we have today.
Yeah. And also, I would say ground that tolerance in like a larger framework of values. Like, you know,
Yeah.
like you're going to have to make some sacrifices on it because once you put it as the central thing and the only thing that matters, you're going to like accelerate it, and then you're going to go, okay, well, this is in tension now with this and this and this, and if you want to value other things, you might have to kind of rein it back a little bit. So,
Yeah.
like, I do think the situation is difficult because people are going to have to really change their value systems a lot if they really want to deal with like the actual real hard problems of today. Um, but anyway, that's another conversation. The other thing I wanted to just point out too, actually, is the kind of just in regards to the liberal oligarchy point, because this is something that Oliver Roy brings out, which is that the destruction of traditional authorities and belief system and values has led to a kind of neoliberal normativity obsession. So they're
Totally. Yeah.
installing and the example he uses
Yeah.
here is like the end of chivalry. So you don't have kind of more patrilineal chivalry. Um, and what you get replacing that then is a kind of a load of like norms, like around kind of restricting behavior, obsessions with consent, and a kind of punitive kind of feminism in the courts and so on. Like Sweden's a good example of this. Um, uh, and and I think that's interesting because like one thing that Oliver says is that in order to have chivalry, you have to have culture. In order to have culture, you have to have like roles and shared values. And if you don't want roles and shared values, you're never going to have culture. So you're never gonna have like the expectation that people are gonna sort of behave towards each other in a more respectful way. Like once you disintegrate that culture and those roles, like you open up room for a kind of more exploitative behaviors. And then once that happens, then you have to introduce a lot of norms to control those exploitative behaviors, you know.
Yeah.
And that those norms then appear to people, well, because they kind of are, as kind of totalitarian in many ways. So I think
Yeah.
this.
And those norms, sorry, those norms also are totally fragmented for Roy, right? I mean, what he's saying, right, is like with the national cultures and the canon, obviously rooted in a print culture, you have a kind of sense of a transcendent purpose. But once things break down into norms, it's basically what he's saying. It's sort of like echo chambers or you like Sloterdijk, right? The bubbles, or I
Yeah.
can't remember what his thing is, but it's basically kind of like this. People dip in and out of these different um, sort of subcultures. Subculture is, I think, a good synonym for what he's talking about in terms of norms. There's a norm for this subcategory you're in online when you're talking, about this cultural thing, and then another one when you're in the school system, and another norm when you're, with this affinity group, and that breakdown into different sort of normative spaces creates this disorienting culture in which people have a difficulty traversing it in terms of like, well, okay, well, how am I supposed to behave
Yeah.
throughout society?
Yeah, and also I think one of his points is that like when you have coherent value systems, there's more wiggle room. So it's like, let's say your values are equality or your values are like freedom or honor or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can interpret that in many different ways. It sort of allows for more participation. Like, it's like, what does it mean to be free? Okay, well, we have to think about that, and like every generation has to sort of apply that to its own individual, not individual, uh, but like
Circumstance,
generation
yeah. Yeah.
generationally distinct circumstances. And I think again, to point to the boomers, like, you don't get this. Like if you point out to the boomers, like, well, we don't live in the same world you do. They don't really get it. Like they don't really understand
No.
that. Like we'll just be tolerant and work hard at your job and blah, blah, blah. And like they think that those values will get you to the same place that it got them, and they don't really understand that you need like values that allow like the actual like living breathing situation you're in to be to sort of be updated and sort of reevaluated and reapplied and so on and so forth. And when you have norms, you just don't get that. You just don't get that. It's like there's no room for participation and thinking and adaptation. It's just very rigid. And one thing Roy brings out is the excessively explicit nature of society today. So it's like if you go to the underground tube station in London, for example, you'll be told, mind the step, and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. This is a kind of nanny state kind of
Yeah. Oh, we have that here. Yeah.
You have to hear see like
If you see something,
behavioral.
say something.
See
Yeah, yeah,
something, say something. It's like what do you mean see
yeah,
something? It's like I see people, I see a train. What the fuck do you want me to see? But like it's kind of a hyper normativity of everything. In Germany, actually, it's funny because if you, in the train stations, there's arrows pointing up the stairs and down the stairs. It's like, oh, I need arrows telling me to go up and down the stairs now. Okay, okay, but
yeah,
and like anyway, this whole it seems banal to people, perhaps, but like there is something really important to that, I think, because it does indicate a society which has given up on participation and thinking. It's a kind of society which is kind of has a kind of infrastructure and a kind of behavioral kind of like almost like a behavioral handbook, and it says
yeah,
do
yeah,
this and do this and this. And one section he brings up is like the transition from like psychoanalysis to behavioral psychology. So psychoanalysis
yeah,
is all about ambiguity, and like then behavioral psychology is all about changing your behavior. It's kind of normative uh,
mhm.
structures of behavioral adaptation or whatever. So anyway,
Cognitive behavioral therapy too, and you could say too the therapeutic culture today. It's a lot different than before. I mean,
mm,
uh, people in therapy just abound now, but it doesn't seem to be putting them through the kind of rigorous process of self-evaluation and the difficult work of being in having to endure just normal unhappiness that Freud talks about, when he says, yeah, I can't promise you bliss or you know joy in this world, but you just maybe relieve your symptom, your acute symptom. Now therapy is just a kind of perfunctory thing that people do in order to
mm,
kind of take the edge off or whatever. But it's not. And of course, there's all kinds of bad therapy too now, and it's just a sort of like it's part of the kind of adult mollycoddling kind of apparatus that's all over our culture.
yeah,
And yeah, I think. And then that's larger effects too of like kind of the education system, which is something that Todd talks about is you the loss of rigor, the loss, which is part of the end of the canon too. But with the end of the canon, you kind of lose the ability to actually think historically because if you're engaged in like trying to understand Don Quixote, you're trying to read the Iliad or read Shakespeare, right? And not just one play, but like read a bunch of plays and really get into it, then you have to start thinking, well, what's that society like? How's it different from my own?
yeah,
What are
yeah,
the ethical commitments in this society versus another, which is supposed to, kind of um, you know, allow people to, think critically about their own society, but also, imbue them with a sense that there are values to instill in this society, right? I mean, that's the purpose of it. But if there's no canon, then people are basically you have this ahistorical, anachronistic approach to text in which people are saying like, oh, well, Shakespeare was a misogynist asshole because he
mm,
said one of his characters said this thing in a play or something, right? And you get these sort of ridiculous, kind of sort of hysterical reactions to works and reasons for taking them out of the canon because it disturbs the psyche of the student, right? And
mm,
you can see
mm,
that's a very good
yeah, yeah.
representation of that like breakdown to just to norms as opposed to a a transcendent culture or transcendent values.
Yeah, yeah, kind of emotional safety norms, abandon anything transcendental or challenging or thought-provoking in favor of emotional safety, which is like probably the worst aspect to like contemporary society, in my opinion. It's absolutely terrible. But yeah, no, totally. The decontextualization of history is important here too. And I think that it's not only, I think in some sense history itself is to blame for this because I think that what you're talking about is like the imagination. I've always been fascinated by like what was it like to live in like, Alexander the Great's time or something, or what was it like to live in
Mm-hmm.
Napoleon's time? Now these are very interesting times in history, so perhaps we should also think about what was it like to live in, I don't know, like the year 450 AD in Denmark. I don't like, but it's a kind of imagination of the past and what that was like and how people thought and their kind of day-to-day routines and what they had to endure, what they had to endure that was worse than today, but also what they had that was maybe better today. Like they didn't have overstimulation from smartphones, for example. They didn't have to
Yeah.
put up with that. So like, uh, I really do think that there's a lack of imagination in modern society. Probably not just the West, but probably in these kind of wealthy Asian countries as well. I would imagine is quite universal, of not being able to even sort of think. It's not even like not having the sort of concrete knowledge, like, oh, I don't have like I've read all these books on the Middle Ages or something, or it's just like they don't even, people don't even have the imagination of like of that context. They're not drawn
Mhm.
into that. Well, what was that like to live at that time? Like, what did they endure? How were they different to us? And so on and so forth. Like, there seems to be a loss of that. And like you do see with historical figures, like significant historical figures, like a Napoleon figure. I know it's an extreme example, but like a Napoleon figure probably obsessed over what was it like to be Caesar, what was it like to be Alexander the Great. Like
Oh
he
yeah.
thought about that all the time. And then if you go back to Alexander the Great, he thought about what was it like to be Achilles or something. So it's a
Yeah.
kind of mythological reference.
So
So it's like there is a lack of motivation, I think, because your channel is called the end of history. So this is important for your
after the end of history.
after. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
introduced you
It's all good.
completely.
It's all good. Don't worry about it.
It's the
It's all
same
good.
thing. It's the same
Yeah,
thing.
it is.
Yeah,
It is.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so yeah, so your channel is this is important.
You-
This is important
It's
stuff
those
for you.
guys at Bunga Cast have that I think they have a book, The End of History.
That's what
So
I'm mixing it
it
up with.
was
Yeah.
it was the
Okay.
zeitgeist moment to recognize multipolarity and the end of this
Yeah, yeah.
American,
Well, you can
unipolarity.
you can blame them for the mistake.
Yeah. They had it before
um,
we did, so it's not they had
okay,
another title.
we can't accuse them of plagiarism then. Okay.
Yep.
But anyway, it's that lack of imagination that really I think is part of the problem. Decontextualization, which is anyway, that's a whole different topic. We could spend hours talking about that. To jump
Yeah.
back into the culture, to jump from the culture back into the geopolitical, because I do want to talk about this.
Hmm.
Um, European politics is getting very interesting in its context of multipolarity. So we all know Russia and China and America are not friends anymore, and God knows what's going to happen there. But Europe, I find interesting. Todd is French; he's European. I live in Europe, European as well, and very concerned with Europe's role in this because I think it's the most ambiguous player in all of the geopolitical context today. Now I know I appreciate America itself is very divided. Like I don't want to be like anti-American and America's the enemy. America's very divided itself. But let's say the kind of Washington blob who are running the show, they are very much in one camp. The Russians and the Chinese have very much put themselves into another camp. Europe is sort of ambiguously doesn't know where to put itself. We've had blowing up of pipelines. We've had um, kind of unusual, strange, peculiar um, uh, events and things going on in Europe, particularly in Germany in the past few years. You've got the AfD now who are getting increasingly popular. I don't really believe that they're going to be a very principled or consistent political party, but they seem to be leaning a little bit more towards a bit more of a critical of NATO kind of a Russia friendly disposition. Um, Todd himself, like, correct me here if I'm wrong, but like it seemed like when he was in his earlier stage of career, he was a bit more of an Anglophile. He was a bit more, um, he supported Brexit, for example, when it was going on.
Hmm.
And he's completely changed his tune. And I think he's admitted this himself. He said, like, oh, yeah, I was
Yeah.
wrong to support Brexit. And now he's saying that he thinks Germany needs to take a more stronger leadership position for Europe and be kind of more defiant against NATO and against the US and so forth. So that's interesting. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's part of a longer sort of French dispensation to the French always held out the possibility, especially with de Gaulle, right, of playing a kind of counterpole within NATO, and within European politics, um, restore its stature as a great power. and have more of a kind of, a detente with Russia before the end of the Cold War. I think Todd, going back to that book, The Final Fall, on the end of the Soviet Union, where he predicted the end of the Soviet Union, that America played a overall good role in the Cold War in countering the Soviet Union. I wonder if he might change any of that now, but or maybe he might in different historical phases or whatever thought it played more a worse role than he originally thought. But I think overall he thinks that the European elites are entirely a vassal class of the United States. And he has a bunch of reasons. He gives a bunch of reasons for why he thinks that is. Part of it is, in general, the sort of the seduction of American culture is seeped into European culture for so long that Europeans think in through American culture. And so even if, say, these family structures aren't really necessarily the same, or the national cultures involved aren't fully Americanized, there's a kind of convergence at the elite level in European politics with America. And obviously the EU captures that and holds back kind of democratic checks or democratic kind of corrections to the geopolitical course. And he has some interesting observations about the change. One of the reasons he thinks is that it was once Switzerland that was the major tax haven for European elites.
Yeah.
Now that that status of neutrality is sort of has been lost, and most of the tax havens are now like in the Caribbean, and places within the Western Hemisphere. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're captured. That the what does he describe it as? He says the European elites are acting like Latin American elites in the Western Hemisphere did, in the early part of the Cold War, in which governments were easily overthrown. There's a kind of, a military component to the forms of ideological control and the kind of outlawing of certain political parties and stuff. And I think that in Europe, just to give a good example, and this gets into the nihilism in terms of denial of reality aspect, which is what he really means. It's not this metaphysical kind of nihilism thing, but just a sort of tendency to deny reality. Germans had their pipeline destroyed, right? An important part of their national infrastructure destroyed, and they can't even talk about it, right? Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I haven't followed German politics so closely. Basically, for after like a year after it was blown up, and I was like, okay, this government is basically totally controlled by the United States. So I kind of stopped paying attention, and I have some German, relatives, and it's amazing to like talk to them, and they're in total denial about it. And
Wow.
they might say, oh, maybe, who knows, we'll see, but there was no sense of kind of outrage or anger about it. I'm sure the AfD will bring that out, and of course Sarah Wagenknecht is a lightning rod, and she's someone I like a lot. But you see the way that liberals, kind of center left opinion formation in Germany reacts to someone like Sarah Wagenknecht, who they kind of pillory her as a xenophobic figure now, who she's like steeped in the left. She came out of Die Linke from East Germany, and I forget, is she part Turkish, I think, or she's mixed.
No, I think her dad is her dad is Iranian or something like this.
That's what it is. Yeah. And so it's just so there's such a kind of shrill aspect to the way that the center left reacts to her, when really she's kind of that's a kind of figure, I guess on the populist left, who you can see that's a kind of position that could re-coordinate or reorient coherent populist politics. And Todd thinks that this cultural tendencies have helped to lead to this bifurcation within all of our politics between elitist establishment and populism. And the big reason for why that's happening throughout the West is because of the elite's sort of denial of the actual claims, complaints, grievances of the masses of the population.
Yeah, yeah. German politics is getting interesting at the moment. Yeah, I think you're right. The denial of the effects of the Ukraine war and particularly the extreme elements of it, like the blowing up of pipelines, has basically fueled the AfD. And
Absolutely.
if you look at a map of the voting, it's incredible. It's like the entire east of Germany, with the exception of just Berlin, because that's more
Mm-hmm.
cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
But the entire East Germany outside of Berlin is AfD now, and the entire West is like SPD and some other party I can't remember. The Greens are
Yeah.
basically out now. The Greens have just fucked up.
Yeah. As
Like
they should be.
everyone hates the Greens now, which is at least some progress. But
Yeah.
because the Greens are actually a bit of a deranged bunch in Germany.
Yeah. They started out as anti-war in their origins, and now they're just
Yeah,
like the most bellicose, and Baerbock is
I
pretty infantile too.
infantile. I made the point actually that like I do generally get the perspective that some of the German political class, I know they have a denial of reality when it comes to the extreme elements of this kind of vassal state problem, but they're a bit more. As far as technocrats go, they can be a bit. They have historically been, in the past few decades or like end of 20th century, being somewhat competent. And I think that part of that is that they can get a lot of the crazies and put them in the Green Party. Like it's a kind of a containment mechanism for the
For sure.
crazies.
For sure.
Like which isn't a bad
Yeah.
idea. I think the British Labour Party should develop something like this, because part of what destroyed the British Labour Party under Corbyn was the crazies just came into the Labour Party and then just attacked Corbyn. So that was that. But um,
Yeah.
just anecdotally also, because I was in Germany recently, and the uh, I saw Sarah Wagner posters with a Hitler mustache drawn on her. Like I was like, especially from a foreigner's perspective, I was like, okay, here's this like a leftist populist, half Iranian.
Yeah.
She's just a little bit more realistic on immigration and on the Ukraine war, and like and obviously like teenagers, like probably drawing Hitler
Yeah. Sure. I
mustaches.
mean,
It's just like
well, that's
it's
another aspect of
mental.
this period is this like very sort of like shrill, hysterical kind of anti-fascist politics.
Yeah.
Um, it's happened in America with Trump, and I can kind of understand it. I mean, I went to many anti-Trump protests early on, and it's the problem just is their analysis is wrong in the sense that
Mm.
basically in America, obviously the center left, jumped headlong into this basically Russiagate, uh, uh, political uh, campaign, which was based on lies, nihilism, right there, right? Um, Obviously, I can understand people, believing what their authorities tell them for a while, but if anybody now thinks that Trump is a Russian agent, then they're just like,
Yeah.
they're not thinking. And but this has to do also with the historical legacy of the left. It cut its teeth basically by sort of reconstituting a kind of popular front anti-fascist politics. What happened earlier on in the 30s kind of was reinstated to a certain degree in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of that, especially in Europe, had a lot of that had to do with kind of national memory, remembering either if you're in Germany, the great historians who sort of had great critical insights on the rise of fascism and a kind of coming to terms with that within their own national culture. But people are trying to reuse that again for something that is not fascism. It's just a kind of populist adjustment to a obviously decrease in living standards or loss of social mobility, a kind of breakdown of society, people reacting to that and wanting to find solutions to it does not make them fascist. So the a lot of the elites are basically shooting themselves in the foot by not actually accommodating it, right? I mean, and that's what's so sort of bizarre to see. It's very much a kind of uh, just like um, it's got a bit of that tone deaf aspect that you imagine it must have been like right before the French Revolution amongst
Yeah,
elites,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And when
yeah.
they're just totally unable to adapt. And part of the reasons are this cultural and generational experience. But then there's for Todd, I think these are states that are in a sense, I wouldn't say they're not occupied necessarily by America, but once you have American bases in countries and you have such a deep generations long imbrication of their elites with American military elites,
Mm.
what that means is that they can run information operations in other countries. They're working hand in glove with their intelligence services. Their intelligence services are under surveillance by America. And so even if people come up to try to make adjustments, there's the ability of the Americans to see them coming around from around the corner and, foil them. I don't know. I mean, this is me speculating, obviously, but everybody there was didn't the Snowden files released, or showed that Angela Merkel was under surveillance. I'm sure there's surveillance all over the place. Israel does surveillance on America. It's part of the game or whatever, but the extent of it, I think, is pretty it's pretty elaborate. I think also in the Snowden files, or no, not in the files, but in one of the stories he relates, is that like one of the things that got him so disillusioned was that how they basically ran a blackmail operation on an EU official or a political figure in, I forget where he was in Europe, but basically they got the guy. It's in the movie, the Oliver Stone film, where they get him
Yeah.
pulled over on a drunk driving stopper and use that to blackmail him.
There was a French official
Yeah.
also who was caught, having a kind of a bit of having an affair, but like, also doing something kind of sexually a bit embarrassing in the affair.
Mhm.
I can't remember the name of it, but I tweeted a screenshot of the news article as I was reading this book because Todd points to this, not this
Yeah.
specific incident, but like he points to this tendency. And then I was like, wasn't there a thing in the news? And I Googled it and I was like, oh yeah. And there was this French politician basically who was speaking out against something, he's speaking out against NATO or America in some capacity. And then not long after that, he was leaked video of him doing something a little pretty embarrassing. Happened. So that was, yeah, like honestly, this stuff is real. Like I know it sounds like Jason Bourne kind of stuff, but it's 100% happening.
Yeah.
And
It must be extremely uh um just must be torturous to have to, be a politician in that environment.
yeah, yeah.
I think that yeah, one can start sounding conspiratorial, but like look at us. I mean, we have cameras on all of our devices.
Yep.
We know there's
Yeah.
a Pegasus software out there that can activate and can insinuate itself in our devices very easily.
Well, actually, I have a theory of this is kind of sidetracking, but I have a theory of
Yeah.
like a part of the populist character of someone like Trump is the product of this because it's like, look, if you want to stand up against any system at all, you have to just basically be like, someone's got you on camera doing something embarrassing. Someone's
Yeah.
got messages of you saying something stupid. Someone like you just have to be like willing to go put it online. Don't give a shit.
Yeah.
You have to
Exactly.
be shameless. You have
Totally.
to be
Absolutely. Yeah.
like if you're like this, and I think this is one of the reasons the boomer regime politicians are so incompetent and so easily subdued is because they're kind of like, oh, I could never. I think they want to save
Yeah.
face. They want to save face. But I'm a tolerant, enlightened, rational person. It's like, no, like that doesn't work anymore because everyone's got something on you, and also it's a bit fake anyway. But like,
Mhm.
it's not even it's not even a question of it being fake or not. I think it's a question of like how easy it is today to uphold that image. If that image of yourself is attached to your authority, and you're trying to do that in the age of like smartphones and internet and so forth when everything's recorded, like it's just you just can't do it. Like you have to just be willing to be a bit shameless and a bit embarrassed. Yeah. And if you're not
Yeah.
willing to do that,
Absolutely.
you're totally controllable. So yeah, that's something that's pretty interesting. I do also just want to get on. If you have
Yeah.
any more thoughts on that stuff, of course, chime in. But I also just want to get on some of Todd's thoughts on Germany because he's got some interesting thoughts on Germany. He says Germany is still relatively collectivistic in its sort of anthropology. It's or at least it's got a latent tendency in that regard, which is one of the reasons it's
Mhm.
been so economically successful after World War II. It sort of projected its sort of collectivistic desire to achieve kind of a shared project into an economic fervor, I suppose you could say. There is even sort of somewhat seemingly trivial things, but I do think that they're somewhat important. Like in Germany, for example, like you don't cross the road on a red light. Generally, people really do wait. In Berlin, it's a bit
Yeah.
different. It's a bit different, especially
Yeah.
like especially if people have had a few drinks or is a
Yeah. Yeah.
is no one around. But like if you go anywhere outside of Berlin, for example, like literally people do wait, and like I like
Highly conscientious. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, highly
I,
conscientious. I'm like, just go! Like, what are you doing? Like,
yeah.
it's incredible. Or like putting the things in the right bins.
Totally. Yeah.
Putting the
Yeah.
it's like you got recycling, you've got like no, you got you got
Biological waste. Yeah.
biological waste, paper, plastic. Like in Ireland here, people just throw everything in the fucking bin. Who cares? And
Yeah.
that's probably not good. Like it's probably actually good to do what they do. They also have things like which I actually quite like, which are things about recycling. Like there are sort of recycle points just in cities where people would just leave
Mhm.
leave shit, like an old
Yeah.
couch, some old clothes, and like people will just go and take it if they need it, and they won't, make a mess of it, or they won't like, throw it everywhere. Um, because you can get money from plastic bottles or glass bottles in the
Totally.
supermarkets.
Yeah. Yeah. And you
People,
see like teenagers do that. They do that work of like picking up lots of bottles so they can get money.
it's not just fucking teenagers. Like
Yeah.
I've seen men in business suits pick up a few
Yeah.
bottles and put it in the thing, and and like they'll leave plastic glass bottles like by a public bin, not in the bin, by it, and then someone else will come and pick it up and put it in the. So if you're going to the pub and you have a few drinks, for example, you can leave the bottle there, and then someone will pick it up. And
Mhm.
in Ireland, for example, like that would just be smashed on a Saturday night.
Yeah.
That bottle would be smashed on a wall within 20 minutes. you know,
Yeah.
and it's quite incredible how actually there is a kind of conscientiousness in them. Sometimes it's a bit neurotic and a bit annoying, but it can also be helpful if you're trying to produce a cohesive project of some sort, and that applies to politics, of course. And interesting, like Sarah Wagner Party started with like just a random party as an offshoot of Delinka, and within like a year she had like 15% in a lot of
Yeah.
areas. That's remarkable. That's like a
Absolutely.
remarkable achievement, and I'm not sure that would be possible in Ireland or the UK or maybe France or other countries. I'm not sure. Like there is a kind of cohesiveness, and Todd does bring out the point of this cohesiveness. He brings out the point that if you include all the German speaking countries, you've got over 100 million people. Because if you got Germany alone, it's 80 something million people. You got Switzerland, you got Austria, and so forth. You've got actually a significant German speaking population within Europe. And as a leader of that kind of European project. England's now gone its own way because of Brexit. The French and Germans have always had tension, and they continue to have tension, and that's a difficulty. But Todd's French, and he seems to be hopeful that that could be overcome. Do you think like Todd seems to be hopeful that like the Germans could play like a kind of more leading role in establishing another balancing power, between the
Mhm.
Russias and the Chinas and the Americas. Like maybe it's a bit too optimistic. Perhaps I don't know. But like I'd actually like to see that, to be honest with you. I don't know what do you think?
Well, it seems like I'm guessing what Trump is going to do is draw down support for Ukraine, allow the Europeans to negotiate um, and handle, depending on what they decide, it could be to continue to support this, kind of vestige rump state in Ukraine that maintains a kind of remains a thorn in the side of Russia, so they can keep up the ghost of kind of weakening Russia, which is, I would argue, the ultimate purpose of this whole, absorbing Ukraine into NATO and sort of, kind of intractable indifference to Russia's security concerns and acting as if it was the most absurd thing for Russia to be concerned about this, which was I think is another aspect of the the nihilistic denial of reality aspect to the Western elites. Um, so a lot depends on the ability of Europeans to form a consensus, which would mean it depends a lot on these European countries converging around these sort of upstart populist parties or coalitions of parties. Let's say in France, someone like Mélenchon, even Le Pen, but they won't work together. And so Macron has been good at you know creating these sort of ad hoc um, coalitions to keep Le Pen from power. But I think I would guess that the trajectory here is for those parties to come into power and for them to negotiate and at least participate in it from the either background or somewhat more symbolically American kind of led but European government agreed upon peace with Russia. Now that's going to that's going to anger a lot of Ukrainians, and I actually think that the fact there are a lot of Ukrainians all over Europe, and that there is the Western Ukrainian sort of political formation, would still be in power. They could do a lot of be very disruptive for European politics, and the way that America will ultimately kind of leave them in the lurch is going to inflame their politics. And I can't imagine Zelensky stays in power if there's a peace, because when they realize the full extent of the casualties and KIAs, it's going to be, I can't predict exactly what's going to happen in Ukrainian politics. And so there could just be what a lot of people who I follow, like John Mearsheimer, predict a frozen conflict in which there really isn't fighting, but there's low-level combat zones and no longer the chance, probably, of nuclear war, but this is going to be a festering wound, I think, in Europe. And yeah, it's hard to say, but I think that America is going to pull out, is going to pull away. And part of this also is I can see a kind of overall American strategic vision of somewhat weakening Europe so that it's dependent upon America, right? Now that they've got Germany away from Russian natural gas, and there isn't a promise of that being renewed, they will not grow as much economically. So they'll be in a kind of a recession across Europe, dependent on the United States, and not a possible that they'll be weakened, and they won't be as much of they will definitely not be an independent power pole. And so that's what I would predict in the for the foreseeable future in Europe. And ultimately it's sort of self-defeating actually for the West because because they failed to weaken Russia through this whole process. And
there's weakening an ally. There's weakening their own
exactly
ally instead of weakening their enemy. It's ridiculous. Like,
right. And they can probably still control European politics enough to not have countries leave NATO because they've all been, because, whatever we say about America's sort of, double crossing or sort of bad faith gestures over over the entire Biden presidency regarding Europe, which is also part of this nihilistic aspect in what he describes. And we should go into this about the Washington gang. He describes it is this hyper moralism in international politics, all this, this sort of pontificating about rules-based order, all the while yielding the results, which are essentially the destruction of the Ukrainian nation, the failure of their strategy to weaken Russia because of their basic inability to do basic military math. Like, Russia is right by Ukraine. It's much bigger population, huge industrial base still. They lied to themselves and to their own populations about it just being a gas station with nukes. They didn't, things didn't take into account things like the, inheritance, this legacy Soviet system of the ability to produce shells. which is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
important, high intensity conflict. And of course, not looking at, well, actually, Russia produces just as many engineers as all the United States. It has half the population, but
Mm.
it has, like, in absolute terms, the same number of engineers, right? And so just this inability to, um, kind of understand the capacity of a state to defend itself or to produce combat power, um, all the while pontificating and standing on their high horses about what they were going to defend, um, is something that all of the European elites participated in. And why have they done that? Because they basically rely on American military spending to defend them, right? And they don't want to, because while they are in recession, or while they're in while their economies shrink, the idea of now sustaining, much bigger military budgets is not going to be appealing to them either. I think that's probably what they, expect.
Mm. Yeah. My one sort of optimism about the European situation is just that, like, I do think in some sense, uh, like Germany's economic success in the post-war era has been a benefit and a poison to it, because I think it's motivated it to be in a more supine geopolitical position. Obviously, that's
Mm-hmm.
also because of what happened in World War II. Like, they kind of had to be in a more
Yeah, yeah,
supine bit, because it was like all the world was like ready to kill, and in order to put them there. So it's like, and obviously, because of what happened, it was probably very necessary at the time. But in the long run, there, a lot of economic comfort, it could be a poison to initiative and cohesion. And although I do think Germany still retains the capacity for cohesion, it has been very much an economized cohesion, and um, perhaps a little bit of a setback economically might perhaps motivate them into a more politicized form of cohesion, or a more cultural form of cohesion. Um, it, so in that sense, I think maybe actually in the long run, things could, it could be a small amount of pain for a kind of longer benefit kind of thing. Um, we see that with the repoliticization of at least East Germany with the AfD, and also Sarah Wagner Party to an extent as well. Um, my problem with not just Germany, but like right wing populism in general, whether it's like Maloney or whether it's Le Pen or whatever, is I feel like there's an over focus on immigration. Now, I'm not saying that like there isn't too much immigration. There is, and I'm not saying it's not being handled badly, because it is. But like
yeah.
I feel like there's an over focus on it. I feel is a lot of right wing populists are kind of saying, "Hey, look, if you just get rid of like a certain amount of immigrants, everything will be great again." No, it won't. So, like,
No,
if your
no.
ruling class is being, controlled by a a foreign, deep state or whatever you want to call it, and your ruling class has bank accounts in the Caribbean, or all this kind of issues that Todd brings out, like, you're not just gonna get rid of some immigrants and everything's gonna be brilliant again. That's just not gonna happen. Like, that's just ridiculous. I feel like a lot of the right wing populists don't want to kind of confront that and actually formulate a more cohesive project for Europe. Like, okay, well, if it ends up having to have more independence from the US, because the US just withdraws its support, but still kind of tries to control it. Because this is the thing about Trump. Like, I think you're right. Like, this is what he's gonna do. He's gonna withdraw a lot of the kind of more unipolar hegemonic support, which is good for the whole world, but it will be sort of difficult for Europe for a period of time. But he's probably still gonna use some pretty barefaced and shameless mechanisms to try to keep Europe in its place.
Yeah.
And like, that will mean the relationship will go from a kind of Faustian agreement with America, where it's like, right, look, you know, you guys make as much money as you want. Have you, relax. It's the end of history. You've got a kind of gerontocratic ruling
Yeah.
class who just want to make money and go on holidays, and then we'll deal with the geopolitical affairs and we'll do all the military spending, and you don't worry about it. But you're going to lose your sense of sovereignty. That's a Faustian dynamic. Go into the Trump era. You don't have a Faustian dynamic anymore. You just have a fucking parasitical dynamic. It's like we're not going to help you. We're not going to do military spending. We're not going to cover your ass. But
And we're not going to allow you to have economic ties with China either, which is very important for the
yeah,
next generation of, EVs and a lot of high tech sector, led economic growth. And Europe for a while has, this is not so much about the Ukraine war, but they have no real kind of independent tech sector the way the US and China does.
yeah.
And so they're going to fall behind there too.
Yeah. Because that's exactly what I'm saying. Like it's gonna be like we're gonna tell you who you can and cannot trade with. Okay, but we're not gonna do our military spending for you. We're not gonna sort of play our role in the previous sort of NATO order. So it's I just can't. And oh yeah, and also people are blowing up pipelines. I just can't see even the decadent ruling class of Europe at the moment persisting as they are in that situation. I just can't see them being able to keep going like that. I just think that situation will be too much, and they're going to have to change or be replaced. Which is basically kind of what's already happening. My problem with it is just like all the stuff we're talking about doesn't really get mentioned by the populists. They just kind of focus purely on immigration. But anyway, um, Russia. I just want to bring up something about
Mhm.
Russia because there's like eh, I want to get your opinion on this because I've always thought that the opinion that Russia wanted to take over Ukraine and wasn't as strong as I thought it was. And the Ukrainians were, even for the first year and a half, were sort of surprisingly um, strong in defending themselves. I've never been convinced that Russia wanted to take the whole of Ukraine. I've never been convinced
Yeah,
that Russia
me neither.
like wanted to hold it. That would be a nightmare,
And all the
And,
proof you need of that is Antony Blinken over and over again saying, Ukraine has been successful. They stopped Russia from taking all of Ukraine. Now, of course, what belies that is the fact that Russia was involved in negotiations, the beginning of hostilities. Boris Johnson goes in and says, "No, don't sign that document. Don't sign that treaty. Fight on. We'll give you all the material you need. We'll train you up."
good old
And
Boris
it's
Johnson, yeah.
totally failed, right? And so yeah, I just think that uh this trajectory, the way that the conflict unfolded was that the elites believe their own propaganda a lot. And of course, I think at the
Mm,
higher levels they know, and one of Todd's diagnoses is that this goes into the nihilism aspect. It's the ultimate point is to not allow Ukraine to be ready to be a member of the EU and NATO. Load it
mm,
up with a ton of debt so that it's fiscally impossible for it to integrate with the EU. Basically, kind of destroy its, ability to exist as an independent state. It'll make it sort of dependent and at arm's length. And Todd also has a pretty, I would say, menacing or really bleak diagnosis about some of the reasons why they're doing this. And he uh, he, he ties it to, in general, a Russophobic attitude of Western elites,
mm.
um, and that they basically did an intel military operation in which they got one group of Slavs to bash against another group of Slavs, and that underlying all this is a kind of quasi amongst certain elites. And he does draw attention to the fact that there are a lot of Jews in leading roles in the State Department and American foreign policy who probably have a kind of axe to grind about anti-Semitism
Mm.
against their own grandparents in Ukraine and in Russia, and that the whole operation is basically the operation to weaken Russia, which has failed. Nonetheless, is going to lead this whole situation onto a course in which Ukraine is kind of destroyed, in which its whole
Yeah, it
the
is.
male population, between 18 and 35 is completely decimated, and its demographic tree is basically like a, you know
Yeah,
like a four-leaf clover.
yeah. Its whole fighting age population is just pretty much gone now. Like, well, I mean, through emigration or through,
Right. To
um,
both. Yeah.
and also Todd does have a sort of he does have a criticism of Europe in this regard, and he says that like Europe was in a labor shortage at the time, and then that influx of immigrants from the Ukraine was actually beneficial. That is one aspect which I generally try to defend Europe in these situations, but like that is one aspect of the kind of biopolitical almost
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
motivations for like not doing the right thing, which would have been to although to be fair to Europe, they did try get a peace deal and fucking Boris Johnson fucked it up. But
Yeah.
there's also these other underlying kind of demographic issue incentives to perhaps not be as enthusiastic as they should be in trying to end the war and so on. So it really is terrible for Ukraine. But I do wonder, like as you were saying earlier with excuse me, the Western Ukrainian sort of nationalism obviously is gotten quite intense, and you've had the empowerment of a lot of kind of pretty nationalistic kind of ethno-nationalistic elements within the Ukraine. Now, I don't know if everyone like that is basically dead at this point, if possible, but like, um, like Europe's going to have this difficulty now if America kind of withdraws in that, like how is it going to deal with this a highly militarized and nationalistic element within the Ukraine, which is going to resent them and hate them, as you were saying, if they try to do a peace treaty with Russia. You know, and
Yeah.
I mean, people are blowing up pipelines, and obviously, I think there's a, you know, I think you need like either the British or the American, CIA or the you basically need either British or Americans to run that, but you could incorporate militants and nationalists from the Ukraine to help out in that regard, or to do the sort of do the hard work of it. Um, like I don't know, like I just can't see this going very well, and I could almost see like a sort of nationalist, maybe not terrorism, but like something quasi-terroristic going on, within Europe,
Totally. Yeah.
within Ukrainian nationalists, like resentful of the fact that the Germans and the French wanted to do a deal, blah 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 blah. I don't know how that's going to play out. It's going to be pretty awful. Um,
Oh,
yeah,
well, like 6 months ago, even Zelensky, I mean, I might be reading too much into it, but I wasn't the only one to observe it. Was it Zelensky said something like, there are a lot of Ukrainians throughout Europe who will be very upset if, we don't get the support we need. And it was just a passing comment, but yeah, there's definitely I would anticipate there's going to be a kind of, and this happens all the time. I mean, if you look at the Vietnam War and exiles from Vietnam and people from Eastern European countries during the Cold War, they form an important constituency within the national politics by creating interest groups and even lobbyists on the more legitimate side of things. But then you can have terrorism and intel operations going on from their behest to affect European politics. I'm not saying it'll happen, but I definitely wouldn't be surprised if that happens.
yeah, I wouldn't
I
be
mean, if they've
surprised either.
even in what one of the official narratives, right, within Germany is that six Ukrainians on a boat called the what was it called? Um, Not Pandora. It was called something. They say anyway. They say this like little ship is what you know. Set sail. It's like a weekender. Vessel is what brought these divers to who are Ukrainian, and that
Uh,
who's the general? What's the guy who's now a British sort of envoy or ambassador to Ukraine. Oh my God, I can't think of his name.
I can't remember.
That he knew about the operation to blow up Nord Stream. So
Yeah,
even which I don't think is true, but according to the official narrative, things that were published in Wall Street Journal, I think a year ago or so, a year and a half ago, is that Ukrainians, perform that, high level act of pipeline terrorism or whatever you want to call it. And so already there's an admission that kind of thing could happen.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, like, even I mean, I think actually even generationally, there's something very interesting going on in Europe right now, also in the market. But in Europe, because its society is being thrown back into history, I think much more aggressively in some sense because of the geopolitical situation than, for example, the UK or America. I think the UK and America probably have more of a sense of like, let's go back to the 90s or the 80s, and let's just kind of perpetuate that for a few decades. Where with I feel like in Europe, it's like because they're caught in between Russia and America like this, and they're dealing with these pipeline sabotages and these intelligence issues, and they're sort of realizing that their previous partners are no longer trustworthy, uh, and they don't know what to do about it, and the stakes are pretty high.
Salugny was the name I couldn't think of. Sorry.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
but
sorry.
the stakes are pretty high. I feel geographically, Europe has always suffered, obviously, because it's closer to the Middle East, and now it's closer to Ukraine than America is. So when America leads a sort of failed geopolitical project in those parts of the world, generally speaking, the terrorist attacks, j- just like we saw in Germany just before Christmas, um, or just after Christmas, where it takes the brunt of a lot of this, a lot of the failed. Um,
Absolutely. And it's been doing that for more than a decade. I mean, you could
yeah,
say a lot of the immigration in the last 15 years has been the product of American foreign policy disasters in the Middle East.
yeah, and you could even go
You
back
have to
to
wonder if that's by design.
yeah, yeah, and like you could even go back to Gladio B in Italy
Oh,
and Greece.
mhm.
In Greece, people don't know about this shit. Like
I know.
Gladio B. Everyone should Google Gladio B and watch like whatever YouTube documentaries there are about it because that's some pretty good ones.
The
It's
BBC
yeah,
did great stuff on that. Like in the 80s, there's a great
yeah.
thing on Gladio in Italy. Yeah. Forget the
Yeah,
name of it, but yeah.
is it an English documentary? It's like BBC kind of thing, or
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
can
yeah,
if oh, what's it called? Yeah, I forget the exact name of it, but yeah, there was, a few producers in BBC who just did these great geopolitical kind of
BBC.
conspiracy type documentaries.
Yeah, BBC used to do some good stuff. To give
Yeah.
BBC credit, yeah, yeah. So it's like Europe's always been. It's funny because you have this sort of tranquility and this kind of end of history peace and this prosperity on the surface, and the boomers really represent that. But then beneath that, you just have this kind of explosive, underhanded, powder keg, always ready to go. And
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that if you look at how young people are thinking, particularly in Europe, I think I think a lot of the older generation in Germany, to use the example, like are shocked that like these young men could be leaning towards the AFD, for example. And it's like it's not so shocking if you take it into context because they're realizing their societies are being run into the ground, and they're also probably sick of a lot of the like neoliberal sort of norms and restrictions which are being put on top of them to sort of deal with the cultural and spiritual issues that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
So it's like completely understandable if you actually take everything into context. But I feel like again this sort of blind, ignorant elite doesn't want to think about that stuff. But it's going to have to. It's going to really have to. It's
Yeah.
going to get a. It's having a cold shower. Like European politics right now is basically in the middle of a cold shower. It's just like refusing to accept what's going on. But yeah, there you go. Great. So, do you want to? I don't know. Do you have any other topics you want to talk about? Any last thoughts? Any concluding remarks?
No,
Any?
just I'll just say one thing is like, yeah, I think that, and I'm a person on the left, and so I think this makes me think about this, the sort of hoary discourse of, the West
Yeah,
and the tradition of the West and how it has to be reforged. And, for a long time in the current period, it does make sense that it's the right who's kind of captured the sense of like, the West is in decline and we have to reinvigorate the Western tradition and, all this stuff. But the left has to do that too in certain ways. I mean,
yeah.
the left has to, um, obviously for understandable reasons, it had a kind of its anti-imperialism, um, gave it a sort of powerful orientation towards criticizing you know Western domination of the rest of the world, but it has to also um, orient itself towards reconstructing the West as a coherent cultural power block, and not on a kind of xenophobic or intolerant basis, but um, not allowing its societies to be run roughshod over and fragmented in all these ways.
Mm,
And how the left might do this in the coming period without becoming, you know, uh, xenophobic, intolerant, and racist is an important, I think, kind of generational ordeal and problem it's going to have to deal with, because I think a lot of that is going to have to be revolve around citizenship, the notion of citizenship, not on the basis of color, not on the basis of uh, um, skin color or you know family lineage and whether or not someone's parents were born out of in another country, but that you
mm,
have people who live here and work in integrating people into society, so that you can still, I think, it's very close to the end of the breakdown of this previous performatively cosmopolitan type of politics that happen in the in the sort of more um, I don't know, grandiose and celebratory era of the unipolar world. But countries like Italy, France, and Germany
mm,
reconstituting a left populism is
mm.
one of the orders of the day. And so I think the left has to stop using populism as a dirty word, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, totally. Yeah, the most insightful people or the most kind of hopeful people I come across generally tend to be sort of still kind of leftist in certain regards, geopolitically, economically, but kind of a bit, at least more conservative compared to today's kind of standard liberal or progressives when it comes to culture and social issues. That's kind of where I'm leaning towards generally politically. And therefore, I don't really know where to locate myself because I'm sort of in between two different things. But I think it's also just good to speak to people that are, a bit more to the right of you, a bit more to the left of you. There's always good to just keep that discourse open. It's unfortunate when people close this stuff off and they say, "Well, we're not in the same camp," because I don't really know what camp I'm in. Like I couldn't close people off because I'd have to know what camp I'm in first. If I knew that,
Mm-hmm.
maybe I would, but no, I'm joking, I wouldn't. But yeah, it's bad, but um, but yeah, no, it's. I think you're right about the kind of project of reorientation. I think that's crucial. The kind of boomer regime has given us a certain orientation. It's not just that they're wrong or they're limited. They've given us a sense of orientation which is distorting us, and we don't really know what to think about things. We don't know how to ideologically parcel out our own views of things and so forth. And the project really is a kind of clarity project and an orientation project, I think, which has to happen, I think, before anything more concretely political can occur. Because if everyone
Mm-hmm.
just like took to the streets tomorrow and says, "Let's fight this," it's take in Europe the example of the kind of pipeline sabotage. If like everyone just decided tomorrow in Germany, for example, all right, we're going to accept this happened and we're going to be angry about it. It's like, well, like, what's our sort of political orientation by which we even address the issue to begin with? I think that's one of the
Mm-hmm.
reasons that there's a lack of outrage because people don't know how to come. They really don't know how to come to terms with the issue because if they admit the issue, then all of a sudden it puts them in the position of going, well, then what do we do about it? And
Yeah.
who do we
And
and
then people
who?
are afraid, oh, I'm going to be saying what the AFD, well, even if the AFD
Yeah,
isn't saying it necessarily, I'm not sure.
yeah.
Then a lot of people fear that if they say a truth, it'll embolden their political opponents. I think
Mm,
that's a big part of the
yes,
culture
yes.
throughout the West. If I admit this thing about crime, or I admit this thing, say about Nord Stream, oh, well, then I'm just going to bring my, the opposing political party into power. And but the thing is, you just got to be able to say the truth. That's the first step. I mean, because
Yeah.
then you can start, you know, ripping off the taboo about it.